Something happened in the last few weeks that the mainstream media buried under celebrity gossip and political noise, and if you missed it, you missed one of the most seismic shifts in Middle Eastern history in the last 50 years. Because Saudi Arabia just pulled off something so calculated, so precise, and so devastating to Iran's regional ambitions that even voices inside Tehran are now quietly admitting what they never thought they would ever say out loud. That the war for Middle Eastern dominance is slipping through Iran's fingers and there may be no way to get it back. This is not a drill. This is not exaggeration. This is the story of how one kingdom, through a combination of military positioning, economic warfare, diplomatic chess moves, and sheer strategic patience, has brought the self-proclaimed revolutionary powerhouse of the Islamic Republic to its knees, without firing a single bullet directly at Iranian soil. And the most terrifying part for Tehran? They saw it coming. They just couldn't stop it. Let's go back to understand how we got here, because this story doesn't start last month. It doesn't start last year. It starts decades ago in the burning sands of ideology, oil money, and religious rivalry that has defined the Persian Gulf since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. When Ayatollah Khomeini stood before the world and declared that Iran would export its revolution across the Muslim world, Saudi Arabia heard that message loud and clear. It was a direct threat, a declaration of war wrapped in religious language. And from that moment forward, these two powers have been locked in a Cold War that occasionally turns very, very hot. Iran built its strategy on what military analysts call the axis of resistance, a web of proxy forces stretching from Lebanon through Syria into Iraq, down through Yemen, and threading its influence all the way to the Gaza Strip. Hezbollah in Lebanon became Iran's most powerful weapon, a military force so well armed and so well trained that it fought the Israeli military to a standstill in 2006. The Houthis in Yemen became Iran's missile platform aimed directly at Saudi Arabia's heart. Iraqi militias became Iran's land bridge, a corridor of control connecting Tehran to the Mediterranean Sea. This was Iran's masterpiece. Decades of investment, billions of dollars, thousands of lives, all building toward a single goal: regional hegemony, with Iran sitting at the top of the Middle Eastern order. And for a long time it was working. Saudi Arabia looked reactive, slow, and uncertain. The Yemen war, which Riyadh entered in 2015 expecting a quick victory, turned into a grinding nightmare. Houthi missiles and drones were landing inside Saudi territory. Aramco facilities were struck. The world watched and wondered, is Saudi Arabia actually capable of confronting Iran's sophisticated proxy network? But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody in Tehran fully anticipated. Saudi Arabia stopped fighting Iran's war on Iran's terms. Think about that for a moment. Every time Saudi Arabia sent jets into Yemen, every time it imposed a blockade, every time it launched a conventional military response to a Houthi attack, it was playing by Iran's rulebook. Iran wanted Saudi Arabia bogged down in Yemen. Iran wanted Riyadh to look like an aggressor. Iran wanted the international community to see Saudi missiles hitting Yemeni civilians, while Houthi attacks on Saudi soil were framed as resistance. It was a brilliant trap, and Saudi Arabia walked into it for years. Then something changed in Riyadh. The thinking shifted, the strategy transformed, and the man at the center of that transformation is a name you already know: Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince who has redefined what Saudi power actually looks like in the 21st century. MBS, as he is known across every intelligence briefing room from Washington to Beijing, did not just modernize Saudi Arabia's economy with Vision 2030. He modernized Saudi Arabia's entire strategic doctrine. He looked at the regional chessboard and asked a question that sounds simple but carries enormous weight. What does Iran actually fear? Not Saudi jets, not Saudi ground troops. What Iran truly fears is isolation. What Iran truly fears is irrelevance. What Iran truly fears is the day when the Arab world stops seeing it as a powerful patron and starts seeing it as a desperate, economically collapsing state, clinging to proxies because it has nothing else to offer. And so Saudi Arabia began constructing exactly that reality for Iran. Brick by brick, deal by deal, dollar by dollar. The first earthquake hit when the Abraham Accords began reshaping the region in 2020. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco normalized relations with Israel, Arab states making peace with the Jewish state, shattering the old narrative that the Arab-Israeli conflict was the permanent organizing principle of Middle Eastern politics. Iran was horrified. Why? Because the entire logic of the axis of resistance depended on Israel being the enemy that united the Arab street against any power that collaborated with the West and with Zionism. If Arab states could make peace with Israel and face no serious consequences, no popular uprisings, no regional collapse, then Iran's ideological argument was exposed as hollow. Saudi Arabia watched the Abraham Accords carefully. It did not immediately join. MBS is too shrewd for that. He let the smaller players go first, let the dust settle, let Iran exhaust its outrage, and then he began his own quiet conversation with Israel, a conversation that sent shockwaves through every corridor of power in the Middle East. Because a Saudi-Israeli normalization would not just be another diplomatic agreement, it would be the complete and total demolition of Iran's regional narrative. It would mean the custodian of the two holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina, making peace with the state that Iran has for decades called a cancer that must be removed from the region. If Saudi Arabia shook hands with Israel, Iran's entire ideological framework crumbles. Every sacrifice it demanded from Hezbollah fighters, from Houthi recruits, from Iraqi militia members, all of it justified in the name of the Palestinian cause and resistance against Zionism, would be revealed as nothing more than a power play dressed in religious clothing. Iran knew this, and Iran panicked. The Hamas attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, needs to be understood in this context. Many analysts have connected the timing of that attack directly to the momentum building towards Saudi-Israeli normalization. The calculation in Tehran and among Hamas leadership was brutal but logical. If you can trigger a massive Israeli military response in Gaza, you can reignite Arab anger against Israel, you can make it politically impossible for Saudi Arabia to normalize, and you can restore Iran's narrative as the defender of the Palestinian people. It was a desperate move to stop a diplomatic process that threatened to make Iran strategically irrelevant. And here's where Saudi Arabia did something extraordinary, something that revealed the true depth of its strategic evolution. It did not take the bait. Saudi Arabia condemned the October 7th attack on civilians. It expressed concern for Palestinian civilians as Israeli military operations began. But it did not abandon the normalization track entirely. It did not rally to Iran's cause. It did not let Hamas, which serves Iranian strategic interests, pull it back into the old paradigm. Riyadh made clear, through back channels and then through increasingly public statements, that the Palestinian issue, while important, would not be allowed to permanently veto Saudi Arabia's sovereign decisions about its own security and its own future. This was a seismic statement, because it told Iran directly, your most powerful card, the Palestinian cause, no longer controls us, but the Saudi moves went far beyond diplomacy. Let's talk about money. Because in the 21st century, the most powerful weapon is not a missile. It is capital, where it flows, where it doesn't, and who controls the narrative around economic legitimacy. Iran's economy has been under severe sanctions pressure for years, oil revenues strangled, banking system cut off from the international financial system, inflation destroying the purchasing power of ordinary Iranians. The currency, the rial, has collapsed so dramatically that Iranians joke, bitterly, that it has become worthless paper. Youth unemployment is staggering. Protests erupt regularly, suppressed each time by the security apparatus, but never fully extinguished. The Islamic Republic is sitting on a social volcano. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, has been doing the opposite of contracting. Vision 2030 is not just a domestic economic reform program, it is a geopolitical statement. When Saudi Arabia announces a $2 trillion sovereign wealth fund, when it hosts the Formula One Grand Prix, the World Cup, global music concerts, and international investment conferences, when it brings the world's biggest corporations and the world's most powerful investors to Riyadh, it is making a statement to every young person in the Middle East. It is saying, look at what our model produces. Look at what stability, pragmatism, and integration with the global economy creates. And then look at Iran. Look at what revolutionary ideology, regional adventurism, and confrontation with the international order produces. Poverty, isolation, repression. A generation of young Iranians who risk their lives to protest a government that has given them nothing but hardship. This soft power competition is one that Iran is losing catastrophically, and there is no proxy militia that can reverse it. Now let's talk about what is happening to Iran's actual military assets, the proxies themselves, because this is where the picture becomes most dramatic, most consequential, and most irreversible. Hezbollah, Iran's crown jewel, its most powerful and most expensive proxy investment, has been devastated. The Israeli military operations in Lebanon, beginning in late 2024, did not just degrade Hezbollah's military capacity. They eliminated its senior leadership with a precision and an intelligence penetration that stunned military analysts around the world. Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, who led the organization for over 3 decades and transformed it into one of the most formidable non-state military forces in history, was killed. His replacement, his successor, was killed shortly after. Multiple senior commanders, logistics chiefs, weapons depot managers, communication network operators, all killed in a cascade of strikes that revealed Israeli intelligence had penetrated Hezbollah's command structure at the deepest levels imaginable. For Iran, this was not just a military loss. It was a psychological catastrophe. Hezbollah was the proof of concept for the entire axis of resistance strategy. It was the demonstration that Iran's model worked, that you could build a proxy force powerful enough to deter the strongest military in the Middle East and serve as a forward deterrent against Iran's enemies. If Hezbollah can be degraded this severely, this quickly, with this level of precision, what does that say about every other element of the axis? What does it say about the Houthis? about the Iraqi militias, about the entire network. It says that Iran's strategic depth, the thing it spent 40 years building, is far more vulnerable than anyone in Tehran wanted to admit. And Saudi Arabia has watched every single one of these developments with a cold, careful eye, because each blow to Hezbollah is a reduction in the threat that Iran can project toward the Gulf. Each degraded weapons depot in Lebanon is one less missile that could potentially fly towards Saudi oil infrastructure. Each eliminated Hezbollah commander is one less operational brain managing the threat that Saudi Arabia has lived under for decades. The Houthis present a more complicated picture. But even here, the trajectory is shifting against Iran in ways that will have long-term consequences. Yes, the Houthis have continued their missile and drone campaign. Yes, they have disrupted Red Sea shipping in ways that have drawn global attention and forced international naval deployments. But here is what the headline writers often miss. The Houthi campaign, while tactically disruptive, is strategically self-defeating for Iran's broader goals. Every time a Houthi missile targets international shipping, it creates more international pressure for the conflict to end on terms that the Houthis and Iran cannot fully control. It brings American and European naval power into the Red Sea in a more assertive posture. It gives Saudi Arabia leverage in international forums to argue that Iran's proxy network is a global security threat, not just a regional one. And crucially, it has actually helped Saudi Arabia build a case for a broader international coalition against Iranian proxy activity that Riyadh could never have assembled on its own. The Yemen peace process itself represents one of Saudi Arabia's most sophisticated strategic maneuvers. The China-brokered Saudi-Iran rapprochement agreement in 2023, the restoration of diplomatic relations between Riyadh and Tehran, shocked many observers who interpreted it as a Saudi concession, an acknowledgement of Iranian power, a sign that Riyadh was accepting Iranian dominance in the region. They read it completely backwards. Saudi Arabia agreed to restore diplomatic relations with Iran from a position of growing strength, not weakness, and it did so for a very specific reason: to create a diplomatic framework that would make Iran accountable when it continued destabilizing the region through its proxies. If there are no diplomatic relations, Iran can always claim it has no leverage over the Houthis, no ability to restrain Hezbollah, no responsibility for what Iraqi militias do. But once you restore diplomatic relations, once you create a framework of engagement, you also create a framework of accountability. Saudi Arabia can now go to the international community, to China, to Russia, to the UN Security Council and say, "We tried diplomacy, we restored relations, we gave Iran every opportunity to behave like a responsible regional actor. And look what they did instead." This is precisely the kind of long-game strategic thinking that Iran, with its ideologically rigid leadership, has repeatedly failed to counter effectively. Let us talk about Iraq for a moment, because the battle for Iraq's soul is one of the most consequential and least covered dimensions of the Saudi-Iran competition. Iran has invested enormously in Iraqi politics, Iraqi militias, Iraqi economic dependency. Baghdad was meant to be a jewel in Iran's regional crown, a neighboring country bound to Tehran by shared Shia religious identity, by economic ties, by political infiltration so deep that many Iraqi politicians functioned essentially as Tehran's representatives. But something is shifting in Iraq too. Iraqi nationalism, a force that Iran always underestimated, is pushing back against Iranian dominance. Iraqi citizens, including Iraqi Shia citizens, are increasingly resentful of Iranian interference in their country's politics, their country's economy, their country's sovereignty. Protests in Iraq have explicitly targeted Iranian influence. Iraqi politicians who position themselves as nationalists first and sectarian proxies second are gaining traction. And Saudi Arabia has moved aggressively into this space. Saudi investment in Iraq, Saudi diplomatic engagement with Baghdad, Saudi Arabia positioning itself as a partner for Iraqi economic development that does not come with the strings of political submission that Iranian patronage requires. The battle for Iraq's future orientation is not over, but the fact that it is a genuine battle rather than an Iranian fait accompli represents a significant shift that would have seemed almost impossible a decade ago. Then there is Syria. The Assad regime's fall, and one of the most dramatic political collapses in modern Middle Eastern history, removed a critical pillar of Iran's regional architecture. Syria was Iran's land bridge. Syria was the corridor through which weapons flowed to Hezbollah. Syria was the physical connection that made the axis of resistance a geographically coherent entity rather than scattered pockets of influence. With Assad gone, that land bridge is severed. The weapons corridor is disrupted. The geographic coherence of the axis of resistance has been fractured in ways that will take Iran years to even attempt to address, if it can address them at all. And who is positioned to benefit from the new Syrian political reality? The Gulf states. Saudi Arabia and its partners have moved quickly to engage the new Syrian leadership, to offer economic partnerships, to establish themselves as stakeholders in Syria's reconstruction and future. This is not charity. It is strategic investment. It is Saudi Arabia ensuring that the new Syria emerges as an entity oriented toward the Gulf and the broader Arab world, rather than becoming another theater of Iranian reconstitution. Now let's address what is perhaps the most significant development of all, the internal situation inside Iran itself. The Islamic Republic is facing a legitimacy crisis of historic proportions. The woman life. Freedom movement that erupted after the killing of Mahsa Amini in 2022 revealed something that the regime's propaganda apparatus could not conceal. A vast portion of Iranian society, particularly its young people and its women, has fundamentally rejected the values and the governance model of the Islamic Republic. These are not fringe protesters. These are the children and grandchildren of the revolutionary generation, people born into the system, educated by the system, who have looked at what the system has produced and said, no. The regime has suppressed the protests. It has executed protesters. It has imprisoned thousands. But suppression is not resolution. The social pressure building inside Iran is structural, not episodic. It will not disappear because security forces fire tear gas. It will not be resolved by execution. It represents a genuine civilizational reckoning that the Islamic Republic is not equipped to navigate, because any genuine reform would require dismantling the very foundations of power that the current leadership depends on for its survival. Saudi Arabia does not need to do anything to accelerate this internal crisis. It simply needs to continue existing as a visible, successful, modernizing alternative to the Iranian model, and let the young people of Iran draw their own conclusions. This is perhaps the cruelest strategic reality for Iran's leadership. They cannot bomb Saudi Arabia's example. They cannot assassinate Saudi Arabia's vision for the future. They cannot sanction Vision 2030. All they can do is watch as their own population looks across the Gulf and sees a different possibility. The economic dimension of Iran's deterioration deserves deeper examination because it is the foundation of everything else. A state cannot sustain proxy armies without money. A state cannot project regional influence without economic resources. A state cannot maintain military readiness without industrial capacity and revenue. Iran's oil revenues, the lifeblood of the state and the primary funding source for the axis of resistance, have been severely constrained by sanctions. Iran has found workarounds, selling oil to China at discounted prices, using shadow fleets to circumvent shipping restrictions. But these workarounds come at significant cost, both financial, because discounted oil means reduced revenue, and political, because dependency on Chinese goodwill means Iran's strategic autonomy is increasingly constrained by Beijing's interests, not Tehran's. The rial has lost a staggering percentage of its value over the past decade. Inflation has made basic goods unaffordable for large segments of the Iranian middle class. Brain drain, the emigration of educated, skilled, entrepreneurial Iranians to other countries, has accelerated to levels that represent a genuine long-term threat to Iran's human capital base. The people who might build Iran's future are leaving. The people with the skills to modernize Iranian industry, to develop Iranian technology, to drive Iranian economic growth, they are going to Canada, to Germany, to the United States, to the UAE, to anywhere that offers them a future their own country cannot. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, is actively recruiting talent from across the region and the world. It is building universities, research centers, technology hubs. It is creating the infrastructure of a knowledge economy, while Iran's knowledge economy is bleeding out through emigration. The military dimension of this imbalance is stark. Iran's conventional military forces are equipped primarily with aging hardware. Domestically produced weapons that range from genuinely impressive in some categories to significantly overstated in others. The drone program is real and has demonstrated capability. The missile program is real and represents a genuine deterrent and threat. But the Air Force is flying aircraft that, in many cases, have not been properly maintained for decades due to spare parts shortages caused by sanctions. The Navy is capable of harassing Gulf shipping, but is not a blue water force capable of projecting power beyond the Persian Gulf in any sustained way. Saudi Arabia has spent the past decade building one of the most well-equipped conventional military forces in the world. F-15 fighters, Patriot missile batteries, advanced naval vessels. The military hardware alone is not the story. Plenty of countries with expensive weapons have poorly performing militaries. The story is that Saudi Arabia has been investing simultaneously in the doctrine, the training, the command structure, and the intelligence capabilities that turn expensive hardware into actual combat effectiveness. The intelligence picture is particularly significant. The same intelligence penetration that allowed Israel to systematically dismantle Hezbollah's leadership structure did not happen in a vacuum. Israeli intelligence, with its extraordinary human and technical collection capabilities, operates in a strategic environment shaped by the broader regional realignment, a realignment in which Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states play a central role. The normalization of ties, the intelligence sharing frameworks, the growing security cooperation between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, these are not just diplomatic gestures. They represent a genuine integration of security architectures that has made the entire axis of resistance far more transparent and far more vulnerable than it was even 5 years ago. Iran built its axis of resistance on the assumption that it could operate through proxies with enough deniability and enough operational security to stay below the threshold of decisive response. That assumption is now shattered. The killing of IRGC generals in Syria, the systematic elimination of Hezbollah's leadership, the tracking and targeting of weapons shipments, the penetration of operational communications. All of this tells Iran that its networks are visible, its people are known, and its ability to operate with impunity has been fundamentally compromised. And here's the truly devastating strategic calculation for Tehran. They cannot easily rebuild what has been lost. Nasrallah spent 30 years building Hezbollah into what it became. The institutional knowledge, the leadership relationships, the operational experience embedded in his organization that cannot be replaced in 2 years or 5 years or perhaps even a decade. The weapons depots that were destroyed contained munitions that took years to accumulate through difficult, expensive smuggling operations. Rebuilding them requires money Iran does not have in abundance and routes that are now far more heavily monitored and disrupted than before. And while Iran is trying to rebuild, Saudi Arabia is not standing still. It is continuing to advance its diplomatic normalization agenda. It is continuing to develop its economic ties with Asia, with the West, with Africa. It is continuing to invest in domestic modernization that makes it a more resilient and more attractive regional model. It is continuing to deepen its security cooperation with partners across the region and beyond. The Iranian leadership understands this. The more sophisticated voices within the Iranian system, the technocrats, the reformists, the pragmatists, who have spent careers trying to navigate between the ideological demands of the supreme leadership and the practical needs of the state, they understand that Iran is on a trajectory that leads towards severe strategic diminishment. Some of them are saying so, not loudly, not publicly, because public dissent in Iran carries mortal risk, but in conversations that leak, in analytical documents that circulate, in the tone of commentary from figures who are not hardliners, there's a growing acknowledgement that something has gone fundamentally wrong, that the model is not working, that the regional project that consumed so much of Iran's resources and energy and international standing is not delivering the promised hegemony, that instead, Iran finds itself more isolated, more economically distressed, more internally divided, and more strategically vulnerable than it has been at any point since the founding of the Islamic Republic. This is what Saudi Arabia has achieved, not through a single dramatic military victory, not through a decisive battle that historians will mark as the turning point, but through the patient, sophisticated, multi-domain application of economic power, diplomatic maneuvering, intelligence cooperation, military modernization, and strategic communication, all oriented toward a single objective, making Iran's regional project unsustainable. The implications of this shift extend far beyond Saudi Arabia and Iran. They reshape the entire strategic landscape of the Middle East. They determine the future of the Palestinian cause and who gets to claim its leadership. They determine whether the arc of the 21st century Middle East bends toward pragmatic, economically integrated states participating in the global order, or toward revolutionary, ideologically rigid states using military proxies to pursue hegemonic ambitions. The answer to that question is becoming clearer every month, and it is not the answer that Tehran wanted or expected. What happens next? That is the question that should concern every observer of this region. A declining power is not necessarily a less dangerous power. In fact, historically, powers that sense their strategic position deteriorating have sometimes made more aggressive, more desperate moves precisely because they feel they have less to lose. Iran's nuclear program remains a wild card, the one area where Tehran retains the ability to fundamentally alter the strategic calculus through a single dramatic escalation. The nuclear question is the unresolved thread in this entire story. If Iran believes that conventional deterrence is failing, that its proxy network is being systematically dismantled, that its economy is collapsing, and that the regional order is being restructured against its interests, the temptation to accelerate toward a nuclear threshold capability becomes more, not less, intense. This is the danger embedded in Iran's strategic deterioration. Not that a strong Iran will attack, but that a cornered Iran will gamble. Saudi Arabia understands this. It is why Riyadh has explicitly sought American security guarantees as part of any normalization process. It is why Saudi Arabia has discussed its own nuclear energy ambitions in ways that carry clear strategic messaging about what Riyadh will require if Iran crosses the nuclear threshold. The nuclear dimension of this rivalry is the chapter that remains unwritten, and it is the chapter that could yet transform a Saudi strategic victory into a regional catastrophe if it is not managed with extraordinary care. But here, in this moment, as we assess the balance of power in the Middle East today, the picture is undeniable. Iran entered this decade as a revolutionary power with a growing regional network, an ascendant ideology, and proxies that seem to be expanding its influence from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. It is exiting this period of history with its most powerful proxy severely degraded, its land bridge to Lebanon severed, its Iraqi influence contested, its Syrian ally gone, its economy in structural crisis, its population in open revolt against its governing model, and its narrative, the central story it has told about itself and its role in the region for 45 years, exposed as increasingly hollow. Saudi Arabia entered this decade looking reactive, bogged down in Yemen, uncertain about its role in a changing region. It is emerging as the undisputed center of gravity in the Arab world, economically dynamic, diplomatically sophisticated, militarily credible, and strategically positioned to shape the Middle Eastern order for the next generation. The war between Saudi Arabia and Iran was never declared. No formal armies crossed any border. No treaties were signed and broken. It was fought in proxy battlefields, diplomatic salons, in oil markets and intelligence networks, in the contested narratives of the Arab street. And it was won, not with a single dramatic blow, but with the slow, grinding accumulation of strategic advantage that eventually becomes so overwhelming that even your enemy must acknowledge the reality. Tehran knows. The analysts know. The military planners know. The reformists, who have watched decades of sacrifices, produce nothing but international isolation and domestic repression. They know. The war for Middle Eastern dominance that Iran launched in 1979 has not ended with Iran's triumph. It has ended with Iran's exhaustion. And Saudi Arabia is standing, larger, stronger, and more consequential than at any point in its modern history. That is a fact that will define this region for decades to come. And the world is only beginning to understand what it means.